From France to Germany, the aftermath of the war was horrendous. In lands where the war had taken place, factories, buildings, churches, roads, and homes were devastated by the war. In this video, the creator is representing war and demonstrates how war affected the land. Civilians were devastated in the aftermath of the war and quickly became mad at the Central Powers and blamed them for the damages of the war. Because the civilians believed that the war was caused by Central Powers, and since the damages were caused by the war, they demanded reparations or money to pay for war damages from Central Powers.
The French mobilized almost 8.5 million men. The British nearly 9 million. The Russians 12 million. And the Germans 11 million. World War I finally ended in 1918. The human and material costs of the conflict were staggering. It is estimated that 10 million people died and 20 million were wounded. After the fighting was over, famine and disease added to the death toll. But World War I's enduring impact was even more far-reaching. The treaties that ended the war planted the seeds of conflicts yet to come.
In 1919, the Paris Peace Conference was held to determine the destiny of Europe and the former Ottoman Empire and other colonies around the world. Although the Central Powers and Russia were not permitted at the conference, there were many other countries present, but there were three main men from three different countries who played a key role. President of the United States Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and French leader Georges Clemenceau.
The Great War was over. On the 11th of November 1918, an armistice had been signed. In Britain and France, the survivors celebrated victory, the return of peace and the end of bloodshed. And the defeated would have to pay the price of peace. To the west of Paris stands the great palace of Versailles. It was here that the peace treaty with Germany would eventually be signed. But before that could happen, much had to be decided. In January 1919, 2 months after the armistice, the delegates of the victorious powers arrived in Paris for the peace conference to draw up the terms to be offered to the defeated countries. In all, the representatives of 27 nations attended that conference. But of all the statesmen who came to Paris to settle the peace, the most important were President Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau, the French Premier, and Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain. Each had very different ideas of what to do about the central problem of Germany. Clemenceau, like most Frenchmen, knew what he wanted out of the peace: revenge. Reparations for the damage the French had suffered and guarantees that a similar war would never, could never happen again. The idea that Germany should be let off lightly would have seemed sheer madness to Frenchmen who'd seen the effects of the German war machine on their own country. In order that scenes like this could never happen again, they wanted a Germany stripped of her wealth and armed forces. In contrast, Woodrow Wilson appeared to promise a just and lasting peace, not punishment. Europe acclaimed him as the great and good man from the New World. This was because his 14 points seemed to promise a new moral order in international affairs. No more secret diplomacy, reduction in armaments, and a League of Nations to protect all countries from aggression. But while Wilson was planning the future of Europe, Americans were rapidly losing interest as their boys came back home. They wanted a peace that wouldn't involve them in European affairs. Surprisingly, it was Lloyd George who fought most strongly for German interests at Versailles. Behind him was a public elated by victory, but eager for revenge. The Prime Minister appeared to share their opinion, but really had no time for those who wanted to destroy Germany. What mattered to him was that Germany should be made stable and allowed to recover her strength as a trading partner. This was the kind of Germany he feared, a land of miserable refugees, poverty, homelessness and starvation. all conditions likely to provide a perfect breeding ground for the new disease from the East, communism. In Berlin, his fears had already been realized. A communist revolt had broken out there in early and turned them loose on the communists. Berlin briefly became... Within a week, the revolt was crushed. Meanwhile, in Paris, whilst the German government was squashing the threat to its own existence, the Allied leaders were arguing their way over the whole future of the German people. Under their hands, the map of Europe was drawn and redrawn again. At last, after more than 3 months of discussion, they presented the terms of their treaty to the Germans. Germany lost. It was not only the loss of territory which Germany resented, but also the fact that Czechoslovakia and Poland now contained large numbers of Germans. And as if to add insult to injury, the treaty forbade German-speaking Austria to unite with Germany. Her fortifications were to be destroyed. Her army was to be reduced to 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines, and to accept blame for starting the war and pay reparations. In protest at Scapa Flow, the British naval base, the Germans scuttled their fleet rather than hand it over to the Allies. It was a last defiant gesture. Germany would have to agree to the terms. She was in no position to restart the war. So, in the high summer of 1919, the German delegates were brought to the Great Hall of Mirrors at Versailles to sign the peace treaty. It was a compromise peace that satisfied not even one single Allied leader, and predictably the Germans loathed it.
Wilson promised the enthusiastic crowds what he called a people's peace, a peace based on his own high principles, a lenient peace that would last and be fair to all. But other leaders, like Britain's Lloyd George, disagreed, as did Clemenceau of France. They had different concerns to be addressed. The peace conference was held in the ornate palace of Versailles. Wilson set the agenda. He wanted self-determination and democracy to be the guiding principles, and to ensure peaceful resolution of future conflicts, an entirely new organization would be created, the League of Nations. But France, fearful of German rearmament, insisted that Germany be handicapped by having to pay the full cost of the war in reparations. German representatives were given no chance to negotiate. They were forced to accept their guilt and sign a punitive settlement.
Nachdem die Bedingungen des Versailler Vertrags bekannt geworden waren.
When the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were announced, the German people were dismayed about the conditions that were imposed, dismayed at everything that was expected of us, dismayed at the payments we had to make, that were sure to lead the German nation to ruin.
Die das deutsche Volk zum Ruin führen mussten.
The treaty, setting up the League of Nations, scheduling war reparations, redrawing frontiers, was designed to prevent war from ever happening again. But few who welcomed the settlement at the time wanted to acknowledge the problems it was storing up for the future. For the moment, the victors ignored the anger of the Germans. But German humiliation and resentment would fester and grow. And the main architect of the peace would soon find that many Americans at home wanted nothing to do with his League of Nations.